All right, so today we're going deep, really deep, into a case that I think you're going to find fascinating. It's one of those stories that just grabs you and won't let go. We're talking about Danny Lee Barber.
Danny Lee Barber, a name that sends chills down your spine if you know anything about the darker side of Dallas County history.
He was a serial killer who operated in the late 70s, early 80s. And what makes this deep dive so unique is that we have this incredible collection of sources to work with. We've got police reports, court documents, even Barber's own words from his execution. It's like having a front row seat to a true crime drama.
It's not every day that we get such a multifaceted view of a case like this, you know?
Yeah,
We're able to piece together these different perspectives, and that's going to give us some real insight into Barber, his motives, the impact his crimes had. It's going to be quite a journey.
it is. So let's start by setting the scene, taking ourselves back in time. Dallas County in the late 1970s. Think disco music, big hair, platform shoes, a very different world. It was during this time that Danny Barber began his reign of terror. His first known victim was Mercedes Mendez. She was tragically murdered on January 17th, 1979, just 48 years old.
Mercy Mendez, as she was known, suffered a truly brutal end. Beaten, sexually assaulted, and then shot 3 times in the head. They found her body in a wooded area near Mesquite. It's a grim way to start our exploration, no doubt, but it's crucial to acknowledge the reality of Barber's crimes.
Absolutely, we need to face that stark reality. And sadly, Mercy's story was just the beginning. A few months later, on June 18th, 1978, Raymond Curley became Barber's next victim.
We don't have as much information about Raymond Curley's murder as we do about some of Barber's other victims, and that's something we often encounter in these cases, you know? Gaps in the record, missing pieces of the puzzle. But it's vital to remember that each of these victims, every single one, represents a life cut short, a story left unfinished. They weren't just statistics, they were people, and that's something we should never forget.
Right? The human element, the individual stories, they can get lost in the statistics. We can't let that happen. Barber's next victim was Mary Caperton. She was murdered on April 21st, 1980. Again, the details surrounding her case are scarce, but it reinforces the fact that every life lost added to the ripple effect of Barber's actions.
Absolutely. The ripple effect, that's a good way to put it. The lack of information about some of these victims is frustrating, but it's also part of the challenge, right? We're working with what we have, piecing together the fragments, and even with those limitations, it's chilling, the picture we get of Barber.
It is, and the picture gets even more disturbing, I think, when we look at the case of Janice Ingram. This case becomes a pivotal point in the whole story, a game changer in a lot of ways. Janice was killed on October 8th, 1979, in Balch Springs, Texas.
Yeah, and what makes Janice Ingram's case stand out, what makes it really significant, is that Barber actually knew her. And not just Janice, but her mother as well. He had done some work on their properties prior to the murder.
Wow, so there was a pre-existing connection. That's incredibly creepy. To think that he would target someone he knew, someone who might have trusted him, that adds a whole other level of unsettling to this whole thing. What do we know about the actual crime itself? How did it happen?
Well, from what we know, Janice was home alone on the night of the murder. Barber later confessed that he initially went there to burglarize her house. He found an open door and just walked right in.
Can you imagine? You're home alone, and suddenly there's an intruder, someone you might even recognize.
And when she saw him, Janice screamed. It startled him, and that's when, according to Barber's confession, he snapped. He grabbed a pipe he'd found in her backyard and attacked her.
And it was a brutal attack. He beat her repeatedly, focusing on her head and face, then stabbed her in the throat. He left her body there, and it wasn't discovered for over 2 weeks. Tragically, it was her own mother and brother who found her. I can't even fathom the horror of that discovery. To find your own child, your own sister, like that.
Horrific, absolutely horrific. And unfortunately, the story doesn't end there. It gets even more disturbing. Barber confessed to committing necrophilia with Janice after he murdered her.
God, that's just, I don't even know what to say to that. From a psychological standpoint, what does that tell us about Barber? What does the act of necrophilia say about his state of mind?
It's a dark act, no doubt about it. It's often associated with power and control, the need to exert dominance over the victim, even in death. That, combined with the sheer brutality of his attacks, paints a picture of a deeply disturbed individual, someone who's lost touch with any sense of empathy or humanity.
Right, it goes beyond just violence. It speaks to a whole other level of darkness. So we have these brutal murders, this chilling connection between Barber and at least one of his victims. What eventually led to his capture? How did they finally catch him?
It's strange how these things work out. It was actually a seemingly unrelated crime, a simple flea market burglary that landed Barber behind bars. And while he was in custody for that burglary, he confessed. First to the murder of Janice Ingram, and then, shockingly, to the murders of Mary Caperton, Raymond Curley, and Mercy Mendez.
It's incredible how seemingly random events can play such a pivotal role in criminal investigations. One wrong turn, one slip-up, and the whole house of cards comes tumbling down. It makes you think about all the cases that might have gone unsolved, if not for some twist of fate, some seemingly insignificant detail.
It really does make you think, doesn't it? And it underscores the importance of those small details, those seemingly insignificant pieces of evidence. You never know what might crack a case wide open. So with these confessions, the case takes a dramatic turn. We go from investigating individual murders to facing a full-blown serial killer. And the truth, as we're discovering, is even more horrifying than anyone could have imagined.
Yeah, and it seems like we've only scratched the surface. It's just the beginning of the story. Where do we go from here? What's the next chapter in this twisted tale?
Well, now that we have a clearer picture of Barber's crimes, we can start digging into the legal battle that followed. We're talking about a man who confessed to multiple murders, including acts of necrophilia with two of his victims. This is a whole new level of depravity, and it's going to have a huge impact on how the case unfolds. The focus shifts from catching a killer to seeking justice, and in this case, justice was a long and winding road.
It sounds like we're just getting started with this deep dive. Barber's crimes were horrific, but the story doesn't end there. The legal battle, the search for justice, that's a whole other chapter. And from what you're saying, it's a chapter filled with twists and turns, legal complexities, and some very difficult questions about the nature of justice itself.
So we left off with Danny Barber behind bars, having confessed to these horrific crimes. Now the focus shifts to the legal battle that followed and the pursuit of justice.
Right, and in Texas in the 1980s, justice for crimes like these often meant one thing: the death penalty. It was a pretty common sentence, especially in cases as brutal and disturbing as Barber's.
Absolutely. Given the nature of his crimes and the fact that he confessed, it seemed almost certain that he would be sentenced to death. And, in fact, that's exactly what happened. The jury's deliberations were swift, and Barber was found guilty and sentenced to death.
Wow, so the wheels of justice were turning quickly. When was his execution date set?
January 2nd, 1988. At that point, it felt like justice was finally going to be served, that the victims' families would finally get some sense of closure. But as we often find in these cases, things rarely go as planned.
Oh, okay, so there's a twist. What happened?
A twist worthy of a movie script. Just hours before Barber's scheduled execution, it was stayed.
Wait, hold on. They stopped the execution. How is that even possible? I mean, he's on death row, the date's set, everything's in motion, and then suddenly it's halted. That must be incredibly rare.
It's definitely not common. The stay of execution was issued by Supreme Court Justice Byron White.
Wow, Supreme Court Justice. That's serious stuff. But why? What was the reason for the stay?
Well, it all came down to a legal technicality. Barber's defense team had raised some concerns, arguing that he hadn't been given a fair chance to appeal his case.
A technicality. So even though he's a confessed serial killer, he's still entitled to due process under the law.
Precisely. And Justice White, after reviewing the case, agreed with the defense.
So it wasn't about Barber's guilt or innocence at this point, but about ensuring that all legal procedures had been followed correctly. It's interesting how even in such a horrific case, the system is designed to protect the rights of the accused.
Exactly. It's a fundamental principle of our justice system. Due process for everyone. It's there to safeguard against wrongful convictions and executions, to make sure that every I is dotted and every T is crossed, no matter how heinous the crime.
I can see the importance of that, but I imagine it must have been incredibly frustrating for the victims' families. After years of waiting for justice, for some sense of closure, they're told that the execution is being postponed because of a legal technicality.
Oh, absolutely. It must have felt like a punch in the gut. And unfortunately, this was just the beginning of a long and drawn-out legal battle. Barber's lawyers continued to file appeals, while the prosecution pushed for a new execution date. It went on for years, adding another layer of complexity and pain to an already tragic situation.
I bet. It's one thing to know that the person who murdered your loved one is behind bars, but to know that he's still alive, still breathing, while you're trying to pick up the pieces and move on with your life, that must be incredibly difficult to bear. So, after all of that legal wrangling, what was the final outcome? Did they ever set a new execution date?
They did. After numerous appeals and legal proceedings, a U.S. District Judge, Sam Sparks, finally set a new execution date. And this time, there would be no last-minute reprieve. On February 11, 1999, more than a decade after his original execution date, Danny Lee Barber was executed by lethal injection at the Huntsville unit in Texas.
Wow, 1999. So over 10 years after he was initially sentenced to death. Justice delayed, but not denied, I guess. It must have been a bittersweet moment for the families of the victims, knowing the Barber was finally being held accountable, but also knowing that nothing could truly bring back their loved ones or erase the pain he had caused.
It's a complicated kind of closure, right? There's a sense of justice being served. But there's also the stark reality that the wounds left by these crimes, the scars, those run deep and they linger. But the story doesn't end with Barber's execution. Before he was put to death, he delivered a final statement. A series of words that offered a glimpse, however fleeting, into his thoughts and feelings in those final moments.
These last words, huh? I'm always fascinated by those. After all those years on death row, knowing that your time is running out, what do you choose to say? What was Barber's message?
Yeah, those last words, they always get to me. I mean, was it genuine remorse or just a way to try and control the narrative, to go out on his terms?
It's impossible to know for sure, isn't it? We can analyze his words, try to read between the lines, but ultimately we can't get inside his head. And for the families of the victims, it must have been incredibly difficult to hear those words.
It's tough to imagine being in their shoes, sitting there, witnessing the execution of the man who took your loved one from you. Hearing him express remorse, knowing that it can never truly make things right. No, it can't. And that's something we have to remember when we talk about justice. The legal system can punish, it can hold people accountable, but it can't heal those wounds.
It can't bring back the victims or erase the pain that their families have endured. So Barber apologized to Janice Ingram's family, but his final statement didn't end there, right?
Right.
There was more to it.
Right. He went on to claim that he was a changed man, that the person who committed those horrific acts all those years ago, that wasn't him anymore.
Ah, the classic death row conversion. It's something we see a lot, isn't it? But is it genuine? Or is it just a desperate attempt to find some kind of solace, some hope in the face of death?
It's a question that's been debated for centuries. I don't think there's a simple answer. Maybe it was genuine, maybe it wasn't. But what's undeniable is that it adds another layer of complexity to this already complex story.
It does. It forces us to grapple with those big questions about human nature, about good and evil, about the possibility of redemption, even in the darkest of circumstances. So as we wrap up this deep dive into the life and crimes of Danny Lee Barber, what are some of the key takeaways? What have we learned from exploring this dark chapter in Dallas County's history?
Well, we've delved into the brutal nature of his crimes, the chilling details of his confession, and the long and complicated legal battle that followed. We've explored the psychology of a serial killer, trying to understand the motivations behind such horrific acts.
We've also seen the impact these crimes had on the victims' families, the enduring pain and trauma that they've had to live with. And we've grappled with the question of whether someone like Danny Lee Barber can truly change, whether his expressions of remorse were genuine or simply a way to control the narrative of his own demise.
And through it all, we've been reminded of the complexities of the justice system, how it strives to balance the need for punishment with the protection of individual rights. And ultimately, we've been forced to confront some uncomfortable truths about human nature, about the capacity for both incredible darkness and the potential for change, even in the face of our own mortality. It's a lot to process.
It is, and I think the most important thing we can do is to continue asking those tough questions, to never stop seeking understanding, to never stop striving for justice, even when the answers seem elusive. So, as we conclude this deep dive, I'd like to leave our listeners with one final thought. If you could ask Danny Barber one question, knowing everything we know now, what would it be? What question would you need answered to truly understand the man behind the monster? And with that, we'll bring this episode of The Deep Dive to a close. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the dark heart of a true crime story. We'll see you next time for another deep dive into the mysteries and complexities of the human experience.